It's my pleasure to introduce Thomas Johansson, and he's going to be talking about the global energy assessment. And for those of you who don't know this has been a little bit of a quieter activity that's taken place over the past 5 years with hundreds of authors from around the world. The assessment uses processes very similar to the IPCC processes, meaning that there are drafts written, they're sent out broadly for critique and review. Comments are addressed and ultimately leading to this assessment. The assessment is now out. The book is really an encyclopedia of energy. It weighs 13 pounds for those of you. So it's, anyway, it's an absolutely amazing collection of ideas. And Thomas Johansson was the co-director of this study. And so we're so pleased that he's going to be talking about this. Thomas has been a long champion of environmental, climate, and energy themes, emphasizing the role of renewable energy in sustainable development. As the director of the United Nations Energy and Atmosphere Program in the 1990s, he initiated the use of energy as an instrument of socio-economic development. And he was the lead author on energy supply mitigation options for the IPCC's second assessment. His book, Energy for Sustainable Development, was awarded the Volvo Environmental Prize in 2000. So Thomas brings an enormous accomplishment in the area of energy. And in addition to his leadership of the Global Energy Assessment, Thomas co-chairs the Global Network on Energy for Sustainable Development. He's a professor emeritus of energy system analysis at Sweden's Lund University, holds a PhD in nuclear physics and a master's degree in applied physics from the Lund Institute of Technology. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Thomas Johansson.
Thank you very much, Sally. It's a great pleasure to be here. And from the presentation Sally made, I really see the importance of the GCEP and the work that you're all carrying out. These are the kinds of things we need to know a lot more about. The Global Energy Assessment started, as Sally said, a few years ago, and started to address energy in the context of an overall sustainable future. If you look at history of energy, you can see this picture from 1850 to the present, how bioenergy that dominated has been replaced by a combination of fossil fuels and renewables and nuclear energy around the world. And the big question is, of course, how did these transitions happen? And we know things changed because it became easier, cleaner, more convenient, and cheaper. Now, if we look to the future, we may ask the question, what is the future going to be like here? And can it happen on the same conditions? Or do we have to be more broadly concerned about issues? Let's first take a step back and see how the world has changed over these 150 years. These graphs show how things have developed from 1750 to the year 2000. And you can see the different parameters, and you can see that they have one thing in common. Things grow very rapidly after about 1950. And you can add on a number of frames like this, and you have the same pattern. So what is not evident every day, we see over time as very dramatically changing world around us. It's changing so that, in some senses, the world is approaching planetary boundaries. This is a concept introduced by the Stockholm Environment Institute. And you can see the 10 different areas of concern and where we stand in relation to the green, probably a tolerable field. And in several cases, the world, in their judgment, has escalated above the planetary boundaries. And it seems that this is climate change, this is nitrogen cycles, and this is biodiversity loss. And as you easily understand, these are all related to how we do energy. So the question is, how can we think about energy system that keeps the world going in a sustainable fashion? And obviously, there are many of them. And I'll go through some and give you an indication of what is the level of magnitude of the challenge and what, therefore, the level of magnitude of the change that needs to be considered. First, of course, We have growing populations projected from 7 billion at present to 9 billion 2050. We have aspirations for economic growth around the world, and particularly, of course, in the areas of the world where people live in more or less abject poverty. These people typically have no access to modern forms of energy. There's 1.5 billion people without access to electricity. There are 2.5 billion people that cook on traditional fuels, being firewood, dung, etc. And they do that under terrible health and environmental conditions. This is an energy issue. If you want to address poverty, you need to provide access one way or other to modern forms of energy. Affordability is always a concern, and the question at present energy prices, can that be done when you look at poorer segments of societies, when you look at countries that spend maybe half or more of their foreign exchange earnings to pay for oil? Security of supply has always been a concern, from the level of households to the level of nations, and this is going to be increasingly complicated in many parts of the world that is now approaching a peak oil era. And can we handle the peak oil era in the conventional oil sense without disrupting other important functions and situations? We have the set of health and environment issues, the indoor cooking that I alluded to, and the other environmental issues, including acidification. We have the planetary boundaries, including the climate change mitigation and the generally, at least verbally, accepted goal of staying below a temperature increase of 2 degrees. We have peace-related issues linked to energy. We have ancillary risks like risks of large accidents, nuclear weapons proliferation, linkages to food prices, etc. So here's a long list of concerns that link to how we do energy systems. And as you look at each one of these, it becomes abundantly clear that major energy systems and policy changes are needed if we want to see the world evolve in a sustainable fashion. Now, these challenges need to be addressed adequately, timely, and simultaneously, in the sense that we cannot only focus on one of them, like providing energy services for the growing economies, or another one like providing access to modern forms of energy, or another one like dealing with the climate issue. We need to do these so that they work together and that we don't just exchange one problem for another. Now, this is what the Global Energy Assessment set out to do. Find the ways forward that can understand the concerns and that can move forward in such a fashion that the world becomes a better place and a more sustainable future. The work has involved more than 300 authors from 5 continents. We have had more than 200 peer reviewers, coordinated by review editors, and the final report, as Sally pointed out, has just come out last month and will be available free on the web end of this month. Now, there is, of course, not something that started out of the blue. Here's a long list of things that preceded the Global Energy Assessment of various importance that, if you're interested, you can look at. The authors are typically convening lead authors that have the responsibility for a chapter, typically 10 to 12 lead authors in each chapter. All authors selected on the basis of excellent scientific credentials, but also considering a regional balance and a gender balance. And the CLAs formed the executive committee of the assessment. If you look at this regional distribution, you see that, yes, there are authors from all corners of the world. However, as often is the case in these situations, OECD has dominated. These are all the authors. If you look at the convening lead authors, the regional balance is not better, really. And you can also see the people from North America that served as convening lead authors for various chapters. If we go to the gender balance in the executive committee, you can see that it's not perfect, but it's also not totally male-dominated, as is often the case. Now, if you look at how we managed to do this, we got a lot of sponsors. One of the characteristics of GEA that did work very much along the similar lines of IPCC, but has Sally pointed out, we are not IPCC. We does not have a government control of what we were doing. Although we got government support and government finance, the decisions of what we put forward has done by the assessment. There were also a set of international organizations that supported in various forms and fashions, some industry and some foundations. And in this fashion, we managed to move forward. Let me give you an indication, as this is the climate and energy program at Stanford, of how I perceive the climate issue and the challenge of it linked to this overall energy system transformation. These red embers were put forward by the third assessment report of IPCC. I'm sure you have seen them. There are 5 areas of concern of impacts as global mean temperatures grow. The 0 line was the temperature around the turn of the century, and minus 0.6 was the temperature pre-industrial. Now, as you escalate temperature globally by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees on the vertical scale, you can see how the white areas change to yellow and to red, indicating the judgment made at the time of how serious impacts in these areas would be as we move forward. This was redone by the same individuals and published in 2009. As you can see, in all of the areas, the red fields have moved down by a little more than 1 degree, indicating the growing concerns over the impacts of global warming. This is the 2-degree line, +2 over pre-industrial. And you can say, all right, in the 90s, when this was first put forward, given the understanding at the time, this may not have seemed unreasonable. If you look at the 2-degree line in light of the present understanding, it's much more debatable. And as the world is heading more like 3 to 4 degrees, it becomes even more a matter of concern. And therefore, many people argue that we should try to limit temperature increase quite a bit, and perhaps aim for 1.5 degrees. Now, how serious is this from the point of view of energy systems? We have an energy system that is about 80% fossil fuels. We have about 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions coming from energy. And this is the global emissions pathway that is required, according to the German government expert groups, that is to stay in compliance with the 2-degree line with a 67% probability. And as you can see, emissions essentially go to 0 before or shortly after the turn of the century. And the longer you wait in peaking emissions, the faster the drop has to be to stay below this temperature increase. And as we keep increasing global temperatures rather than decreasing them, you understand the gravity of the challenge and the concern that is associated with this. Now, the challenges, all of them, translate into a need for major energy systems transformation. The main elements, as we find, not surprisingly, is improved energy and use efficiency, renewable energies, and these have the characteristic that they can help address all of the challenges that are indicated. And carbon capture and storage, we find, is most likely also an important, very important element in staying in a situation where emissions can be reduced significantly and sufficiently, I would say. I'll just give you one example on efficiency. Passive buildings. Passive buildings are interesting because in global energy terms, heating and cooling of buildings takes about 40% of the energy used and is about, I think, 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. And we now know technologies exist to reduce that by at least an order of magnitude. And as you do so, with relatively simple measures, it has potentially a large impact. And it has been done. New construction in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, to a large degree has performance of this nature. And therefore, it becomes an issue of see if we can expand this into larger fractions of what is going on. What is also very important is that this is also possible in retrofitting. As you have to renovate the building for other reasons than energy, then you have the opportunity to achieve similar performance in that building. And in Sweden, for example, we face a situation where the so-called million program, there was 1 million apartments built late 60s, early 70s. This is now in a situation where renovation is necessary, and it remains interesting to see if the Swedish society will be able to capture these opportunities rather than just sliding along. Now, how significant can this be? This is a projection of global heating and cooling, assuming a floor area that increases to 2050 by 126%. And it's divided into different categories. As you can see, the stock at present is phased out and replaced by retrofits of various performance and new construction of various performance. So this is an underlying assumption. The energy requirements for this, provided you build passive houses, as you can see, could actually be reduced by 40%, in spite of the increase of the floor area, satisfying the needs for better homes for more people. So this is a very significant opportunity. And if you don't take these opportunities at the point of renovation and at the point of new construction, then you put yourself into a lock-in where you will not have a possibility to significantly change the situation until maybe several decades later. So therefore, it's extremely important to pay attention to what is going on investment-wise in these sectors of such importance around the world. Transportation has other examples, and if you look at, as the assessment looked at it, there was an advanced transportation analysis or projection, building essentially on electricity and biofuels. There was a more conventional that also included fuels derived from fossil fuels derived and developed in such a way that greenhouse gas emissions would not increase, and I'll come back to how that happens. Well, these are the renewable energy flows, and you've seen the flows coming from the sun, penetrating various systems on Earth and returning to space. And there are enormous flows, as you well know. And the main question becomes, can we divert these flows a little bit here and there to satisfy human needs? And we're learning to do that increasingly. These are the performance, the learning curves of photovoltaics that have been going on for quite some time, and as you can see, both scales logarithmic. The drop has been tremendous, and there is also a little bit of a split in the different technologies at the final end of it. So this is an extremely important development that is not just linked to photovoltaics. We see it in wind, and in bioenergy and in other areas. And this has led to an increase in renewable energy investments globally, as you can see here. And these are now, in the new investments are of the order of 1/3 is renewable globally. So things and change had started to happen the last few years. This is what happened with the new electricity generation in the European Union last year. In gigawatt terms, solar was by far the largest, followed by wind and gas, about the same, while coal, oil, and others were close to zero, and nuclear was actually negative because of the closure of the German nuclear plants, essentially, but also some other scheduled closures. Fukushima was, of course, a big factor behind this happening, but it wasn't the only factor. And I'll show you in between what the annual net grid connections were over the last 15 years. And as you can see, wind was growing dramatically. PV has been growing very fast, but just the last few years. And if you look at nuclear, again, it went down globally because of Fukushima, but not only, but also because of the cost escalations. The red ones here are US nuclear energy costs, and the green are French. And they have escalated as a function of installed capacity, both of them over the years, leading to very few new construction getting started in the OECD world. There is a different level of interest in some developing countries, but it hasn't led to very much grid connections yet, and we will see what the renewed revisions after Fukushima will actually mean. Now, doing liquid fuels, an interesting concept that the assessment focused on was the co-gasification of coal and biomass to produce liquid fuels and to produce electricity and chemicals, and combine this with carbon capture and storage. If you do that, it's not so difficult to capture the carbon dioxide and to put it into the kind of storage situations that Sally Benson led the analysis of for the assessment is actually a very interesting way of getting to negative emissions through the use of bioenergy, taking, of course, carbon out of the atmosphere. Now, coming back then to the question of whether we can actually satisfy all of those challenges in some reasonable fashion, we made a backcasting exercise for 2050, assuming that targets could be adopted for 2050, and we approached that by saying, all right, this is a set of targets that seems to be accepted more or less by the international community through conventions, through United System actions, or other means. So we compiled this not as a reflection of our own values, but as an attempt to understand more broadly accepted values, which include economic growth at historical rates, universal access to modern forms of energy, to reduce air pollution impacts in line with WHO guidelines, to avoid dangerous climate change in the UNFCCC. You remember the avoid dangerous climate change. This has been interpreted by the Conference of the Parties to mean 2 degrees, and we can debate sort of how sufficient that would be, but that is what we put into this analysis. Improving energy security through enhanced diversity and resilience of energy supply, and in the process, address peak oil issues and address nuclear proliferation issues. Now, that was sort of the, how can we do a backcasting exercise and see if this can be satisfied? We started by having this envisioned society with people, economic growth, and so forth, and we made some branching points. The first one to the left was in energy efficiency levels. So we have a GEA supply pathway to the state defined for 2050 with not so ambitious energy efficiency improvement. This is the GEA supply and leads to high demand. And we have a medium case and we have an efficiency case. Each of these 3 main branches is split into conventional transport and advanced transport, as I indicated before. And each of those 6 is subject to analysis of 10 different combinations of supply systems. And we see if that can be done. And as you can see at the bottom, the green fields for the high efficiency case, you can satisfy the criteria we formulated in all cases. The supply system has a great degree of flexibility. As we move to the mixed case, there are some combinations that don't work. You go to high demand level and conventional transport. Only 2 of the systems that we looked at could actually satisfy all the criteria. So this is just one example of what it looks like. The most difficult case from the supply point of view is, of course, the high demand. This is a case where you can see bioenergy is growing, coal is phased out unless combined with CCS, gas is reduced significantly, and oil is reduced significantly, and natural gas continues more or less at present and increases in combination with CCS. And then you have renewables that take significant but not a dominating share in this particular pathway. Now, in other pathways, there are more renewables. So if you want, you can go back and say, well, we could actually have satisfied more stringent criteria for what is a sustainable future than was defined in the previous slide. So from a technical point of view and a resource point of view, it seems that this can be done. Now, will this happen in the world as we know it? And I think the answer is very clearly no, it will not. So we discussed various policies that would have to be considered, and we did this in a very general fashion, linked to the major areas of technology opportunities and the kinds of policy mechanisms that would needed to be considered, from regulation standards, externality pricing, careful subsidies, and capacity building. And of course, this is different for each country, in each region, so we couldn't be very specific and situation relevant because of this great diversity we have around the world. But we gave some general reasoning. We gave a lot of good examples that you can find in the pages, and look at and analyze your own situation and see what can be adopted and what can be used. I'll just take one example. Well, I'll take a few examples. But this is the R&D spending of governments, not the private sector as you do here, but by governments. The IEA government has, as you can see, spent significant amounts of money. It peaked in the early 1980s and has then dropped down and remained relatively constant over the last 10 years. Constant, relatively set, has also been the distribution of the research money. As you can see, the bottom fields here is nuclear, fusion and fusion. Then you have fossil fuels. The green one is renewables, and the light blue is efficiency. And you can see efficiency in renewables, that in the understanding of the assessment is the most interesting areas given the overall situation, has received approximately 10% each over these years. So this is an area of significant mismatch in where government-funded research has been supported and where the needs are. If you look at one of the big areas, universal access to clean cooking fuels, 2.5 billion people are affected of this situation, as you can see in the left-hand axis. Then there are combinations of policies that will lead to a much improved situation. And if you don't do no new policies, the second bar from the left indicates that the number of people cooking on traditional fuels will increase to, say, 4 billion. If you put a fuel subsidy for clean fuels, like particularly for LPG, you could reduce the darker non-blue fields quite a bit, down to probably 1.8 or so. If you increase the subsidy, you can go down a bit further. If you do only microfinance of stoves and equipment, likewise, you get a bit, but the real impact you get if you combine fuel subsidy with microfinance, and as you can see, this is down to of the order of 500 million people cooking still on traditional fuels. So here's an idea of how one can move forward. And it's interesting to see that some countries are trying to apply this, and Indonesia in particular, just over the last few years, has made a tremendous difference in changing to LPG away from kerosene in that case in particular. We have public sector energy subsidies that are provided at the rate of 500 million to, no, I dropped the numbers here. I think it's between 500 and 1,000 billion a year, and it changes quite a bit. Most of this goes to fossil fuels, and a lot of this is not pricing fossil fuels at the world market price, so that becomes a subsidy. And if you look at the totals, you see the wedges that are inserted on top are subsidies that go to clean energy. So here's again an area where overall government subsidies in the energy area are not going in the direction of what is needed for global sustainability. Urbanization is an interesting phenomenon. We are facing a world that will probably go from about 50% of the population in urban areas to about 75% in urban areas over the next 40 or so years. And if you combine that with population growth, we're going to build cities for 4 to 5 billion people in this time frame. If you look at that enormous construction of urban areas, you can say that that's a major opportunity to get this right from the outset. Get passive building standards in there. Get transportation systems that are efficient and and you get an outline of the city that minimizes the need for transport of goods and people. So urbanization is a major area to influence both in the industrialized world and particularly in the developing world. The left bar here is, this thing is a simulated energy use for an urban settlement and what can be affected. And the first bar is the 100%, and that shows what the starting point is. By affecting the energy sector, you can reduce energy use a little bit, maybe 20%. If you do buildings efficiency only, you come to the second bar. If you do urban density, you can do significant, like in the buildings efficiency, about half of the energy. And if you combine all of the three, or all of the measures, you're down, the set of measures, you're down to about 1/5 of the starting point. So if you manage to sort of think in strategic and systematic terms around urbanization, it's a major opportunity. As I mentioned, policies are very situation and location specific, so I'll just give some key messages. Technology is important, but it is equally important to address issues related to implementation, that is institutions, market behavior, skills and capacities, etc. The urgency is clearly there, motivated by the nature of the challenges, and also to avoid the lock-in effects that keeps us in situations where the world cannot continue to be. Subsidies and R&D I mentioned, but it's also that we need to think about energy in the context of other big sectors in society and try to achieve complementary policies and get out of this vertical silos where people in transport doesn't talk to people in buildings, etc., and you know them all. Multiple benefits is an important area that we have paid some attention to, and this refers to the fact that if you do investments in renewables, you generate benefits in the form of the energy you provide to the market, but you also provide benefits, if you do it right, in reduced environmental impact, in creating jobs, and reducing the climate challenge, and so forth. So these are benefits of various nature that come with renewable measures and with efficiency measures in particular, and they are typically not reflected, these values are typically not reflected in the market situation of investors. And this, it seems to me, is one of the big underestimated entry points to accomplish change. If you look back at the situation in the climate negotiations at the time of Copenhagen, almost 3 years ago, there were great hopes, and it ended up in just about nothing, because there couldn't be an agreement between the different ambitions of different groups of people and countries around the world. The Western world were essentially pushing for this more stringent emissions control and measures to accomplish that, and the developing world, simplified, would be saying, yes, that's very important, but poverty alleviation is also, if not more, important and urgent. So if you look at ways of combining, how do you address the poverty alleviation and economic growth needs of the developing country, while at the same time addressing climate issue? It seems to me that one would have a way forward. And this is what we're trying to point at and see if we can do that and actually get more of an understanding how benefits can be valued and included in each country. And in fact, China is one of the leaders in actually doing this. China has the most impressive renewable energy developments in the world. They have the most impressive energy efficiency program in the world. Not to the technology levels that we have in the West, but still, a lot of emphasis goes that way. And they don't do it because of climate change. They don't do it because they think it's good for China. And if it happens to be good for the climate, fine, that's an added benefit, but that's not the driving force. So I think this notion that you can think about doing the right things for the world and for your country that are motivated on near-term and local considerations rather than long-term and global consideration has a potential significant power. So these kinds of things are in principle are not new, you know them all, but the assessment provides a lot of details and examples along these lines. So I talked about the multiple benefits, and I think this says what I basically just said. Just come back to the fact that it's not just technology in the energy sector we talk about. It's urban planning, it's transportation systems. Material use is very important. That's about 2/3 of industrial energy use goes for the production of material, 2/3, which means that recycling of material becomes a very powerful entry point. Land use is extremely important for bioenergy systems in particular, but also to avoid running into situations where we get competition over bioresources that are difficult to handle and that can lead to devastating food price increases for poorer segments of societies, consumption patterns, and probably many more. So the value of the assessment approach is lots of single important observation in the chapters, but also that the scenario pathway analysis based on normative goals and quantification of what a sustainable future might look like that you can start using as an entry point. The multiple benefits and the emphasis on other areas where attention has to be given. So a few conclusions finally. There are many combinations of resources and technologies that would address the challenges simultaneously. That's a little bit of a key finding. It can be done from a technology and resource point of view. These combinations create values for society and for individuals that are not reflected in the conditions of the market actors. Efficiency improvement is the single most important area of action, and renewables comes in as a clear number 2. Carbon capture and storage is probably a must from the climate mitigation point of view. Nuclear power may be an option, but it's not a must as shown in the pathway system I showed you for 2050 with high energy demand and a phase out of nuclear. And strong incentives and capacity development are needed and can only be provided through dedicated action by the private sector. And I mean can only in a quantitatively and time-wise the required sense. So this is a very brief summary of the global energy assessment. And as you can understand, 1,800 pages cannot be condensed easily into 35 minutes, but this was my attempt. Thank you.
So we have a couple minutes for questions. So if you have a question, if you raise your hand, and we have some microphones somewhere. But yep, up here. Yep. So Rama. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. You did not address much in the context of the recent increase in shale gas production and how it's going to impact CCS. What we generally see is that CCS costs are not coming down, whereas shale gas seems to offer an easy solution, a temporary easy fix in terms of reducing CO2, or it's a perceived temporary fix. So do you have any comments?
Well, my understanding would be that, yes, shale gas, if it can be produced without significant local problems, which I think, at least in many cases, an open question, would have a short-term impact on the carbon emissions in areas of the world where you have a lot of shale gas that can be accessed. So in that sense, it would be beneficial from the overall point of view. If you look at areas of the world that doesn't have a developed infrastructure for natural gas, it would seem to me that it's not justified to put in that infrastructure. Because, as indicated, we need to get out of these emissions over a few decades only. And then building up a new set of infrastructure to supply more gas doesn't really fit with that objective. So yes, short term, when you have the right conditions, it's beneficial. As a long-term solution, it will not work.
Okay. All right, more questions? Okay. All right, yeah, we've got one here.
We have the fellow on the wall.
Hi, how are you? My name is Claire Vondrich, Climate Works Foundation. Thank you so much for the really interesting presentation. I'm wondering, you put forward this super elegant solution, you know, renewables, energy efficiency, possibly CCS. It addresses so many different problems, global problems at the same time. Yet it's not happening. We don't see the sufficient investment. We don't see the matching between the need and the government and private sector investment. What are we missing? What do we need to do? Is it going to take abject crisis before the world moves? Or are there other options that we can get behind our policymakers and get them to move?
Well, this is, of course, the key question. and it's a larger question in some countries than in others. The set of things I alluded at the end, I think needs to be considered in a country-specific or location-specific context. And it seems to me that one of the underestimated areas of concern is people's and officials, both private sector and public sector, lack of understanding of the opportunities and the overall situation. Then, of course, the way the market conditions are set up and the boundary conditions for markets are often not conducive at all to have investments going in these directions. And here I think the public sector has a great role in shaping the market conditions so that investments flow to areas where you want societal development to be supported. So it seems to me that it's better that individuals and corporations make money on doing the right things than that they make money on doing the wrong things, which is often the case now. So I think and this is a capacity building. It requires an understanding of all these groups of people that is basically, if you go out in society, is not there.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more question, and why don't we go to Chris, sorry, to this gentleman over here.
So my name is Andrew Caldor. I guess one of the things I miss in presentations like this is the uncertainty. Where is the uncertainty monster buried here? And maybe another way of asking it is, was there a minority report with a different view that's a chapter in this volume produced?
No, no minority report.
Isn't that kind of, I can't believe
however,
that everybody agrees with everything.
No, everyone does not agree with everything. But by chapter, all of the authors signed off on the chapter. If you look at the overall report, the summary document, were signed off by the executive committee. So there is a sign-off process of that nature, which means that if there were serious views of non-agreement, they had opportunities to get that inserted, and it didn't happen. But of course, there was a give and take in the production. Review comments, both external and internal, were put forward, and they were addressed to the satisfaction of the review editor, and implicitly then also by the authors. Now, you say the uncertainties here. Well, it's important to note that we are not making a projection. We're not saying this is the way it will be. We're saying that this is the way it could be. It's an if you do A, B, C, then the following can happen. It's a fundamentally different thing, and uncertainties then are of a different nature and much lower than if you try to make a projection to say that emissions by 2030 will be X% of what they are today.
Okay, I think on that we need to wrap up, so thank you very much.